Welcome to the Bird Podcast. My name is Shobha Narayan, and this episode is about the birds of Delhi. So, Delhi and its neighbourhoods have a variety of habitats and landscapes. The city is remarkable for the wealth and diversity of its avifauna, and it's a true haven for bird lovers. So, in this episode, we are focusing on a book which is really described as an enchanting adventure with Sudhir Vyas's book called The Birds of the Delhi Area. It is the ultimate guide to unlocking the secrets of these feathered wonders. This book has been edited by Anita Mani under the Indian Pitta imprint, which is India's first imprint dedicated to birds. Now, about Mr. Vyas, he has 50 years of bird watching experience. He's a former career diplomat, and he possesses an intimate understanding of Delhi's avian inhabitants. He has written numerous articles and studies on ornithology in the Delhi area, and we are going to link to his full bio in the episode show notes section, as we call it, or on YouTube just underneath. But let's get right to listening to Mr. Vyas. Thank you so much, sir, for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you very much, Shobha.
So, for someone who has not been to Delhi at all, can you give an overview of the bird life in Delhi?
Yes, Delhi is anchored very clearly within the northern plains of the Indian subcontinent, and its avifauna, its bird life, is typical of the northern Indian plains. And yet, over and above this, there are overlays which give it its very distinctive character. And I've mentioned some of these, and it is at the junction of two what are called ecoregions or sub-ecoregions. To the east, the upper Gangetic Plain with its wetlands and a distinctive avifauna, and to its west, the Aravali scrub forest ecoregion, which then moves towards a more desert, takes on a more desertic character as you go further west. So you have influences in Delhi from the east, as well as these desertic influences from the west. And a third influence is the Aravali range, which extends along the eastern border of Rajasthan and enters the Delhi area, where actually it peters out and goes within the alluvial, goes under the alluvial deposits that have. It's a very, very old range. It's a range that they say could be 2.5 to 3.3 billion years old. One of the oldest mountain ranges of the world. It's been over the centuries. It's been heavily eroded, often deforested, and yet it brings to Delhi a very special character. Two more points that I'd like to mention. One is that the river that passes through Delhi, the Yamuna River, it has a north-south orientation through the city, and therefore acts as a conduit, as a pathway for a number of migrating bird species, particularly water birds, which follow this route. Secondly, a large number of bird species that breed north of India, the Tibetan Plateau in Siberia or in Central Asia, and winter in the Indian subcontinent, are either winter visitors to Delhi or pass over Delhi as passage migrants if they are wintering in the southern peninsula. One more angle that I want to just bring in, and that is a lot of Himalayan breeding species drop down to the foothills in winter as the weather changes. And many of these trickles further south and can be seen in Delhi. Now, all these influences together is what gives Delhi its distinctive character and the richness of its bird life.
So when a foreigner asks me where should I go birding in India, often the answer most people say is go to the Northeast. But from what you said, it sounds like Delhi is also much more accessible for one thing, but also very rich, isn't it?
Well,
It
you
would
certainly
you say
start
that it
off from
was?
Delhi.
That's right. Sorry, you said you could start in Delhi. It's a great place.
I must add that compared to the southern peninsula, the Western Ghats or the Northeast, Delhi does not have an endemic bird fauna, which are only found here. It is a more generalized avifauna, but a very rich one.
So if we zoom in now a little bit within Delhi, what are some of the good places that you've gone to and that are good for birding?
Well, straight away, I would say the wetlands of Delhi, whether it's the river, which is of course not in the very best of conditions now. It's bad, it's polluted and so on, but there are attempts to restore many of its habitats, and it still remains a very rich pickings for a bird watcher. And I would also then add to that and say that the Aravalli ranges have a number of species which are not otherwise to be found in the other parts of the Delhi area. And some of these isolated outcrops have some remarkable isolated species which are very difficult to find in other parts of India. I mean, if you want a name, if I could mention the spotted creeper, for example, the Indian spotted creeper. People have searched for it a number of places, and there are only a very few places where it can be regularly seen. And the Aravallis in Delhi, some of their outlying ranges are one such place.
So in your articles for BNHS and other publications which I've read, you've talked about the changes in bird life over time in Delhi. And it's perhaps one of the themes of your book. For those who haven't read your book, can you elaborate on that, the sweeping changes that you've seen over several decades?
Yes. My exposure to Delhi's bird life goes back to the 1970s. And when I first came to Delhi as a young officer of the Indian Foreign Service, it was a very different Delhi and a very different biotope that I could explore. For one, the city of Delhi has expanded enormously since then. And that the habitats that was then so easily accessible around Delhi have now got pushed further back. Secondly, a number of what are often called in India wastelands, open country, commons, grasslands have now been increasingly brought under the plow with intensive agriculture and expansion of the satellite towns of Delhi like Gurgaon and Faridabad have taken over a large number of these areas. Also, the river, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, has become much more polluted than it used to be and more constrained through embankments and so on. What are the immediate impacts of this? Firstly, birds that could be found right outside Delhi, particularly, I must say, raptors, many eagles, falcons, birds of prey, harriers, and so on, which were easily accessible from Delhi, today no longer are that easily accessible. You'll have to go much further out from the city to find these birds. They still come in, but much more rarely. The second impact is that the grassland haunting species, the Indian coursers, for example, or the sand grouse, some of the larks, have dramatically had their habitats reduced. So they have become very patchy. We know where they are found, but they are not as widespread as they used to be. But what I feel saddest about is the decline of some of the riverine avifauna. The sandbanks of the river used to be a breeding place for a number of terns, little terns, black-bellied terns, and pratten poles. Indian skimmers used to breed just outside Delhi as it passed through Delhi. And I used to see them. By 1970s, I think the skimmers had ceased to breed, but they would still move up and down the river after and before their breeding seasons. They have dramatically reduced. These also great stone plovers, for example, which Usha Ganguly in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, she speaks of flocks of 40 to 50 such plovers. That's unthinkable today. This is what is changed. And having said that, just one more line. As Delhi has expanded, the city itself has become remarkably, it seems to be a contradiction in terms, a little greener. So you will find fewer of the desert biotope species like wheat ears and so on coming towards Delhi. On the other hand, some species that are more widely distributed and common have colonized Delhi and have become much, much more common than they used to be before.
I was going to ask, is there any positive side to all this development? And you just answered that question. Yeah. So you talk about Usha Ganguly a lot in your book. Have you met her? What was she like?
No, Shobha, I think she passed away. I came to Delhi around 1977, and she passed away in 1971.
Okay.
Her book was published posthumously in 1975.
Okay. Can we talk about species, which is a passion for you as seen in your book, and also for people sitting in Bangalore? We are also very interested. Your book mentions the lesser florican, for instance. Have you seen it?
I have, but not in Delhi. In Delhi, it's a very, very rare vagrant. But the nearest place in Delhi where it is a regular breeding visitor is a village called Sonkhalia near Ajmer in Rajasthan. It is about 3.5 hours journey by rail from Delhi. And I've seen it there. And I've seen the males displaying in the fields and in the grassland. They particularly seem to prefer standing crops of pulses and or grassland areas that abut these fields. They're remarkable birds.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't in your book, or maybe I read about it somewhere else in linking to you. But can you elaborate on the waterfowl that you just talked about, the skimmers and the pratten coals, and which are some of your favorite waterfowl that you've seen, and why?
Well, if you talk about waterfowl, I think you are sort of talking about a very wide range of species.
Correct.
Talking about, for example, the ducks and geese.
Yes.
A diversity of them, a whole diverse numbers. Will come to Delhi in winter and fill up our wetlands, and a few are breed. Only a few breed here. Then we have a number of herons and storks, and Delhi is very rich in herons and storks. And if you, in the monsoon, for example, you will have breeding visitors, a number of bitterns, cinnamon bitterns, for example, yellow bitterns, black bitterns, and perhaps the best place in India to watch these bitterns and see them is right outside Delhi, in fact, within Delhi's limits, at a place called Okhla, where the river has been impounded and has resulted in a pretty large expanse of reed beds, and up to 100 bitterns could perhaps be counted of all these three species in the course of a morning's walk.
Did you mention that? Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I just wanted to continue on water birds. The storks of around Delhi, we've lost some of them. I mean, the birds like the greater adjutant, which used to come here in the past, and I've seen them as late as, well, I shouldn't say recently, but not so far back in the 1980s. They no longer come here. But we still have some remarkable species, and we have the black-necked stork, for example, which is becoming very scarce. And it's only this upper Gangetic plain that has a substantial population. We have several breeding sites around Delhi. They are one of my favorite birds, actually. As also are the painted storks. We have a few very large breeding colonies of painted storks, including within the city, in the Delhi Zoo, where these are not captive birds, these are wild birds. But because there are trees, the trees that are protected, and there is food available in the form of fish that is in the fish ponds. A very large number of storks, cormorants, and a whole host of other herons also have a breeding colony right here.
You mentioned Okla and the Yamuna River. When I ask or keep track of friends where they are going in Delhi, Sultanpur, Okla, and Yamuna keep coming up. Would that be the top three areas where birders in Delhi go, or are there others?
Well, yes, I would say I would agree with that. And the wetlands don't just attract water birds. You have to keep that in mind. They are, because of the number of the density of waterfowl that collect here in winter. You also have a diversity of birds of prey, peregrines, Bonelli's eagles, steppe eagles, greater spotted eagles, can easily be found on a day's outing at any of these spots. Sultanpur in particular is also surrounded by various other inundations. So birds move back and forth. Sultanpur has a breeding colony, of course, but they feed in the neighborhood and spread out. So that entire area around Sultanpur is very, very rich, very productive.
You mentioned your favorite bird, the black-necked stork, but we'll come to that later. One of the things that I was fascinated by your book was that in your writings, particularly your monograph of Delhi birds, you are able to describe variations in quantity. So you have a methodology, it seems, and you also have a way of keeping track and memory. So what are some tips you can give to people who are starting out on how to how to remember and how to track these birds numbers?
I think the bar charts in the monograph are perhaps, I must mention that these are taken from eBird sightings, and only for the last 5 years before the monograph was published. Because prior to that, you didn't have that density of data which could result in a reliable bar chart. Today, yes, and as time passes, you will get more and more data, so such bar charts are possible. But what I have done in the book is very different. In the past, like many birders, when they start off, they maintain meticulous lists, life lists, numbers of birds seen, and so on. So that kind of meticulous records I have with me, and I've preserved them, and they have been extremely valuable. But beyond a point, having understood the avifauna of Delhi, I judge more. I try to assess whether there has been changes, and that is what I try to reflect in the book. Have there been increases? Have there been decreases? Have there been a dramatic decrease? Has there been changes in distribution? Birds that were restricted to particular localities have to become more widespread, and that sort of thing. And this has now become more of an assessment, a mental assessment, but you need that basic data. So I would advise people who or birders who are beginning to sort of explore this hobby in greater detail and focus, to maintain their records, and that will form a baseline for their future work.
How do you maintain it? Do you do paper and pen, or do you do eBird, or do you
paper
do
and pen? At that time, it was all paper and pen. We had no eBirds. We had, in fact, it was not computer records. I have my diaries, handwritten diaries, which have all the details. And that is the baseline on which I've moved forward.
You're actually the second diplomat that we've had on this podcast. Can you talk about your passion and your profession? Are there any similarities that you see, or how do you bring them together?
Well, my wording predates my diplomatic days, but I must say that if you wanted to look for similarities, certainly I think the capacity to observe, the capacity to assess, and to interpolate, or rather, perhaps the right word is extrapolate, whatever you see into a pattern, into a process which you can report upon. So I think there is this is a similarity in a way. I don't think in terms of substance they could be very much in common, but the diplomatic life takes you across the world and exposes you to many, many new habitats, many, many new phenomenon, and that expands your horizons and enables you to see what, for example, you have in India or you have in Delhi, around Delhi, and contrast it with what you see elsewhere. You also see a certain phenomenon. I mean, take, for example, my very first posting in Egypt. It lies on a migration route for birds of prey, which move up the Red Sea coast through the Levant and the Middle East, across Turkey into Europe and Central Asia. And their numbers are astounding. When I'm talking about buzzards, steppe buzzards, for example, I'm talking about thousands, not tens, not hundreds, of thousands of them which move north. Now, when I contrast this with India, or you do find, for example, in the Himalayas, in the river valleys, migration taking place, but it is very different in character. It is more isolated. It is a stream of birds of prey that are moving south, not these kind of vast soaring flocks which you see there. So you can contrast and compare, and you get a broader picture.
You use a lot of Hindi terms to describe the landscape, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Khadar, Bagar, Dabar. For non-Hindi speakers, what are these terms? Can you explain that?
These are local terms, and in fact, actually, in the glossary of the book, I have explained them.
Yes.
The Khadar, for example, is the immediate floodplain of the river, both the Ganga and the Jamuna, which are flooded every year. They are flooded, or well, most years, not every year. This is an area that is flooded and gets fresh alluvium. It has a characteristic and a very rich flora of various kinds of grasses, marshes, oxbow lakes, and little patches of forest. The Dabar is the alluvium. It's an alluvial plain on either side of the river, but this is not inundated every year. This is alluvium that has collected there, and that's what makes the land so fertile over centuries, over hundreds of years. This is old alluvium. It does, however, have a number of wetlands, studded with wetlands and marshes. The Dabar is a term that is used for this saline ground to the west of the Aravallis. Water seeping down the Aravallis absorbs many of the minerals, and as it dries up, it deposits itself on the land. So this is an area which used to have a lot of saline lakes, and salt actually used to be mined a century ago in the area around Sultanpur. Today, Sultanpur, the area around Sultanpur is now irrigated by the canal systems of northern India with fresh water. So the term strictly, the Dauber term, strictly does not exist. It has changed. I must also say that these are all local terms. For example, the Khadar, if you go east in eastern Uttar Pradesh, in Prayagraj or Allahabad, for example, it is called the Khachar, the Khachar, the Khachar. It is the word changes, but every area has a local term, and these are for Delhi. I've used these.
Do the birds also have local? Are the vernacular names still preserved in birding in Delhi or not really?
For some very common species, of course, and birds which really intrude itself into your presence. Take, for example, the cuckoos, the koel, which is of course a Hindi word that's been transcribed into English, or the hawk cuckoo, which is called the papiha in Hindi. Over a wide area in northern India, the word is the same, papiha. The chatak, the pied cuckoo, or the Jacobin cuckoo, which migrates to Delhi in the monsoon, and this season can be heard all over the city. It really intrudes itself into your notice. So wherever there are these kind of birds, the dayal, the magpie robin, which is there in every garden. So these names are fixed. But if you look at, for example, the smaller birds, there have been attempts to try and standardize Hindi or vernacular names, but this is still work in progress.
In Tamil Nadu, which is where I'm from, the smaller birds' names are usually, they usually call it like a sparrow, but then they'll say a sparrow on the shrub, a sparrow on the tree. And I asked a Tamilian birder, I said, why are they not more specific? He said, you have to realize these came up before binoculars. So these were people seeing with their plain eyes, and they described the behavior of the bird rather than the markings, or the name was not pied as black and white. So I just put a new light on it. So
no, it's a wonderful way of putting it.
Yeah.
I like it very much.
Yes. Can we talk about species? You have described so many species, and I always ask my guests, what are your favorite species? But with you, we have to go much broader than that and categorize. You talked about larks, you talked about
favorite species. Now that's a very interesting question.
Huh.
I think anyone interested in wildlife and birds
wants
to be out in the wilderness.
Yes.
And would enjoy open spaces, enjoy the vistas of large numbers of birds in wetlands, or in a bird party, a mixed hunting party of birds in a forest. So, but beyond that, I think, I would certainly enjoy all these. But beyond this, I think there are people who would really revel in certain types of birds. I mean, for example, I like, and you must have heard this before, raptors, or large wading birds like storks and herons, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. I enjoy watching these, and I really, if I have the opportunity to, I would certainly spend a lot of time. Not that I know the others. I would certainly like to see masses of waders along a sea coast or in a lagoon or one of the marshes. There are others who may like to pay more attention to detail, would get into pipits and birds of that kind, which are very difficult to identify. Look at wing formula and wing extensions and the extent of streaking on the underside or upper side and so on and so forth. So that makes another category. Others for whom seabirds maybe like poetry to them. They would revel in watching seabirds or for that matter birds like terns and so on and so forth. Others would prefer would look for color, which of course all of us would, but some who would go to extraordinary lengths to find and photograph birds of color, or birds that hide in the grass, and are otherwise difficult to find. They're rare and elusive birds. They might wish to take them off. So it really depends on the person. And in a lighter vein, I mean, in addition to bird behavior, I think we should also be looking at bird watchers' behavior too.
What about you talked a little bit about land birds, and so are you attracted to them for some reason? Again, the sand grouses or the desert.
Yes, I do like these open spaces, and regrettably, they're getting more and more constrained, at least in the Delhi area now. I like this vista of sea, of the sky and the land, and birds like cranes flying in their formations, collecting in large numbers. Birds like sand grouse, especially if they're coming in to drink as they do every morning, every evening. I like these vistas. I enjoy it.
Last couple of questions. For somebody who's flying into Delhi, is there a bird community, and can you describe it? Where are some good places to encounter other birders in the morning, obviously, but is there a good community?
Yes, indeed. It's a growing community and a very, very, I must say, a very active community. And there are these, now with this advent of social media, you have these WhatsApp groups and so on. And very often, people who are coming to stay in Delhi for a few months, foreigners and so on, will join one of these groups. They are most welcome. And they organize outings often every other week to many of these better known locations. So opportunities are aplenty, whether for bird photography or just for watching.
We are going to put photographs of your book and as well, and link to where people can purchase them. But last question is, if I come for 24 hours and I have one morning, where would you send me?
If you had just one morning, I would say the river at the Yamuna Biodiversity Park, which is a well-preserved area of northern Delhi. Or if one is in southern Delhi, Okhla is the obvious choice. It's a wonderful area, actually. It might sometimes get a little crowded because of the number of people who are looking around, but the birds are abundant.
And absolute last question, what is your favorite species of bird?
My favorite species, single species, very difficult question to ask, to answer.
Interpret it in any way. Or favorite family. Or
family, okay. I'll put it as family. I'll put that cranes.
You mentioned that, yeah. You liked those, and you liked the larger wading birds, yes. Yes. Sudhir Vyas, thank you so much for being part of the Bird Podcast. It was wonderful to talk to you and learn about the bird life of Delhi.
It's really been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for watching and listening.